Welcome to the neophytes of narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned Vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling. At the origin of narrative, desire. Hello, I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with Scott Thoma.
Bonjour.
And Stephen Ramosi.
Ayo.
And we are doing part 3 of SZ by Roland Barthes, our favorite philosopher of narrative. Although, by the looks of my fellow podcasters, that term favorite
Not
can
sure
be
if
used
it's my
loosely.
favorite per se, but go on.
He is a philosopher of narrative, that's for sure.
Yes. So, we are going to be doing the second third of this book now in our ongoing series to get this done. We're going to start off with, without any further ado, with contract narratives. This is section 38.
Mm-hmm.
And really what this is discussing the economic theory of narrative. It is the idea that narrative is not necessarily a linear production, or it oftentimes is, but can also be viewed as what is it worth. This actually reminds me quite a bit of our first podcast ever,
Yes.
which is dealing with what should the cost of video games be?
Right.
What is the
How much
value
am I
of narrative?
owed from
Yeah.
the narrative, if you will?
And he specifically goes into that it's about the narrator providing a narrative to a woman about Saracen Les Zambinella
Right.
in order to get her in bed.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily about a love story between those two, Saracen and Les
I mean,
Zambinella.
it is, but it isn't. But on top of
Yeah.
that, you have this layer to
But
it, essentially.
that's the legitimate
Right.
protagonist he's arguing here is the narrator.
Right.
And I think you raise up a lot of interesting points of narrative as like not only
Commerce, essentially.
as commerce, as a trade.
Yeah.
What is it like? If you want to go back in time to the ancient Greeks, the idea of like a lot of oral history was not only about necessarily giving a political influence, but was also like bards telling tales, like the Homeric epics, all of that, and that was all about contract. It was all about economic value as well. So.
Well, he does say, like, within all that, his little paraphrase, or in parentheses, within this section, he writes that philosophy, italicized, is equivalent to sex. And I guess that may be true. Like, it sort of goes back to what you were saying, like, it's a sort of a deal. And at least in the terms and the framework of the story, that's sort of what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Here's another. Here, the narrative is exchanged for a body,
Right.
contract of prostitution. Elsewhere, it can purchase life itself, 1001 Nights. One
yeah,
story,
good point.
and elsewhere in Sod, the narrator systematically alternates, as in gesture of purchase and orgy of dissertation. In other words, for meaning. The idea of it just being about the story itself and that what the inherent intent of narrative is was interesting to me.
Yeah, no, it's a really good one. It's one of the asides, his musings, that I enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have much more to say about that section.
Good. Now, this is my favorite one because it flies in the face to everything we've been saying for a very long time. This is 39, yes. This is not an explication de texte, which is a formal French way of analyzing stories, which has its closest equivalence to close readings in English.
Which it certainly is.
It's
and
not
he's
But
like
he's saying, no,
yeah.
this is not. Here I feel is where the point he's making is that in a traditional close reading, you're reading a story very linearly, where he's trying to break out from a linear storytelling. And early on, he speaks about rereading texts until it's like that timeline is crumbled.
Yeah.
And I feel that he's saying that the linear narrative can make it feel like Saracen is the protagonist where he's not. That the narrator's actually.
No, that's true. I mean, it's a good thing to point out, and
Yeah.
again, it's well stated.
He is certainly like trying to draw out points from this and trying to draw out like other deeper meanings from this, and like explanation or the description of the narrator as kind of the main character as opposed to Saracen is an interesting aside, where he's saying, look, I'm not just saying what you're thinking as you're reading this, but I'm saying what I think is actually happening on a deeper level, which I get.
I think he thinks close readings will push you to have one interpretation, which might not be the correct interpretation. I think he actually uses the term nesting narratives.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And that's a very good way of describing it. Again, if you're just looking at like the philosophy of narrative, he brings up a lot of neat points in this.
Yeah.
So we're on to section 40, birth of thematics, which is basically the study of themes.
One of our favorite topics in general.
Absolutely. And it's oddly I'm going to describe this as a macroscopic view of the study of literature versus a microscopic view.
Yeah, no, kind of. I would agree with that for sure.
And he's saying that a microscopic view of trying to break it down into all these small parts can actually be destructive, where you want to look at all the upwards, how a story describes to the greater like messages behind it versus trying to chisel away at it. Though I don't think that this is necessarily true to a lot of what he's said elsewhere in his analysis.
That's kind of what I was going to say. While I agree with that notion, I don't think that it happens as much as he wants it to in this book.
Kind of. But no, I mean, like, yeah, that's so true. And I'll just pick out one line from this section that I think sort of exemplifies it. He writes, "To thematize is, on one hand, to leave the dictionary behind, to follow certain synonymic chains, to yield an expanding nomination." So yeah, like, you're not necessarily literally like looking at the definition of every single word, but you're looking at what it's supposed to say, the message is, as you guys were saying.
To read, to understand, to thematize, at least the classical text, is therefore to retreat from name to name, starting from a signifying thrust. This retreat is of course coded. When the unnesting of names ceases, a critical level is established.
Exactly.
The work is closed. The language by which the semantic transformation is ended becomes nature, truth, the work's secret. Only an infinite thematics, open to endless nomination, can respect the enduring character of language, the production of reading, and no longer the list of its products. However, the metonymic production of language is not postulated in the classical text, whence an inevitability of a dice throw can arrest and fix the skid of names. This is thematics.
That's a perfectly Barthian thing to say.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, he's basically saying like it's not just its parts. Like the sum is above and beyond that.
But initially, he said in one of his introductions, he was talking about how the idea of, in a sense, the camping view of narrative, where all work is based off the same stories. He kind of rejects that. Here, he's saying that all themes have this kind of writerly
universal-ish relation,
which kind of goes I think arguing semantics here to camping, but
kind of.
Okay, so now we're on to 41, the proper name, which is very interesting to me as a study of language. We're talking about, in a sense, what makes a proper name. Is a proper name, and this is going back to Frege and a number of other great philosophers. Like, are we just the set of adjectives that describe us, or is there a greater
level beyond that sort of?
Yeah.
Sure.
So here he gives his. I actually think he doesn't really give much of an definite.
Again, he muses upon it, but never really provides an actual answer, or at least a solid
brief
enough
musing.
one.
What is obsolescent in today's novel is not the novelistic; it is the character. What can no longer be written is the proper name. And actually that is a fascinating way of giving kind of an idea of where he stands with this. Because that fits right in with his philosophy from prior, is that when something is written, you create the readerly, and that readerly view gives that character. And the idea is that once a novel is complete, it has developed that proper name. There's no more growth for that character unless
it's
a sequel or something that is made.
Kind of, if you will.
So...
No, I mean, it's a good point, and again, I agree with it broadly.
Okay.
On this time, Barth.
Okay, now we're going to go on to... in my notes, I combined these next two sections.
Okay.
Which are 42 and 43. Codes of class and stylistic transformation. Here he muses quite a bit on, in a sense, referential codes, which it goes back to his 5 ways of doing codes.
Right.
And he's talking about, like, there's the cultural codes, the stereotypes that derive from cultural codes, and how they become, in a sense, cliches eventually.
Or at least have the potential. Can be.
Well, I think that he's like discussing that in order for a cultural code that has become cliche to be used with any sort of power
Impact,
in a work,
sure.
you have to imply irony.
Right.
Or employ irony. So, in a sense, he's trying to argue that the cultural code should be taken more seriously, I suppose. But I don't know if there's much to say about this.
Well, that's what I was gonna, I don't know if there's, in those sections, I don't know if there's that much that needs to be pointed out.
Like, he points that out itself, as you just said, and that's basically...
And I mean, you could definitely see especially in today's world, contemporary works that we see, especially in comedy, cultural codes are often used for purpose of comedy, and especially the irony use of them. So he's very much accurate, I feel, but I don't know if there's anything much more to say about it.
Right.
Beyond that.
Yeah, it's about right.
Okay, and then, actually, this also goes into, in a sense, the historical character, which is 44. And in my notes, I say, it's what it sounds like. And it... But this is
says what it says.
Yeah, this is all about the proper use, or not necessarily the proper use. I think when I say things like that, it's giving it Bart a more instructional feel than he actually does.
No, that's well
It's
said.
more of him pointing out that this is how it is used, like how historical characters are used in narrative in order to make a point, and also like some of the pitfalls I suppose that can fall with that. But it gives reference to a time and a place, and perhaps the inherent views we have about those people. Right. So, like, for instance, Napoleon, it would also tie in all the baggage that Napoleon brings with him into the story.
It gives it sort of he makes 2 points. That one for sure, and like if you like when doing that in a story, it sort of like authenticizes it in a sense. Or like, oh, if you mix like actual historical things and events and people with your fiction, then it sort of like seems more real.
And I think this ties back into my point from a previous episode of S/Z that we were talking about, where he actually, despite the fact that he says that the author should be different, separate from the source material, that he references the authorial point of view as being part of the story. And he does that quite a bit in this book, even though he says that doesn't necessarily want to. I thought.
Sure. In general, to sum up the last 3 ones, though, I think that it's him giving more of a reference to his initial idea of how the codes.
Right.
And showing, this is why referential code is, or why I included referential code on the list of narrative devices you can use.
Yeah.
So, all right, here we go. 45. This will be fun. Scott, should be fair, this is a pretty short one.
Sure.
Would you read this?
All right. Depreciation. This is like the opening sentences in italicized. To begin a liaison, / to indicate its end, / to end it. The antecedent signifies the adventure's absurd brevity, whereas ordinarily, in quotes, liaison is open to 1,000 novelistic expansions and incidents. Basically, by its very structure, proletarianism comparatively depreciates language. Action, in quotes, it is said, speaks louder than, in quotes, words. Once restored to its proletaric essence, the operative mocks the symbolic, dismisses it, italicized, that is. By the incident of behavioral statements, the human action is trivialized, reduced to a horizon of stimuluses and responses. The sexual is mechanized, voided. Thus, by the mere form of its sequence, the liaison of Saracen and Clotilde, I believe is the character's name, Clotilde, perhaps, the relationship between Saracen and that character, keeps the sculptor away from sex. Proletarianism, when reduced to its essential terms, like so many knives, the knives of Acetidon, itself becomes an instrument of castration applied by the discourse to Saracen.
So anyway, next section.
So that's that.
Yeah. Moving on.
I had my actual notes say nothings with asterisk, just read it.
The next one is sort of like that too, kind of.
All right, actually, so there's a number of short ones coming up that I just wanted to read through in order to. This is completeness. The next one, to depart, to travel, to arrive, to stay. The journey is saturated. To end, to fill, to join, to unify. One might say that this is the basic requirement of the readerly. as though it were prey to some obsessive fear, that of omitting a connection. Fear of forgetting engenders the appearance of a logic of actions. Terms and the links between them are posited, reinvented, in such a way that they unite, duplicate each other, create an illusion of continuity. The plenum generates the drawing intended to express it, and the drawing evokes the complement, coloring, as if there really abhors a vacuum. What would be the narrative of a journey in which it is said that one stays somewhere without having arrived, that one travels without having departed, in which was never said that having departed one arrives or fails to arrive? Such a narrative would be scandal, the extension, the hemorrhage of readerliness. And I actually quite like this idea because it's something you don't really... Again, he does like to point out some things you don't necessarily consider because narrative is very intuitive. But the idea that narrative requires you hitting certain
there
points...
has to be certain things there
right.
in it. Otherwise, it's no longer narrative.
Yeah. And that it would inherently fail to describe... Like, if you want to describe action, there are certain triggers to...
Yeah.
It's a very flowery way to describe a very obvious thing, I think.
I don't know if it's obvious because again, it's intuitive, but
right.
You don't necessarily think that
You
when
might
you're
not
telling
think
a
about
story
it
that you have to
until pointed out,
or to avoid ambiguity in sentence.
Sure,
it works. So now we're moving on to
the titular section, if you will.
SZ, which begins a whole section, a series of sections that have less to do with narrative philosophy and more to do with how SZ itself
is
structured. So, here you go. We'll read another section. Saracen. Customary French onomastics would lead us to expect Sarrazin. On its way to the subject's patronymic, the Z has encountered some pitfall. Z is the letter of mutilation. Phonetically, Z stings like a chastising lash, an avenging insect. Graphically, cast slantwise by the hand across a blank regularity of the page, amid the curves of the alphabet, like an oblique and illicit blade, it cuts, slashes. From a Balzacian viewpoint, this Z, which appears in Balzac's name, is a letter of deviation. See the story Z Marcas. Finally, here Z is the first letter of La Zambinilla, the initial of castration, so that by his orthographical error committed in the middle of his name, in the center of his body, Sarrazin receives the Zambinillan Z in its true sense, the wounded deficiency. Further, S and Z are in relation of graphological inversion, the same letters seen from the other side of the mirror. Sarrazin contemplates in La Zambinilla his own castration, hence the slash. Confronting the S of Saracen and the Z of Zambinilla has a panic function. It is the slash of censure, the surface of the mirror, the wall of hallucination, the verge of antithesis, the abstraction of limit, the obliquity of the signifier, the index of the paradigm, hence of meaning.
It's monkey versus robot, S versus Z.
Yeah.
They're at odds.
Yeah.
I get it. But it's just funny, it's what it's like to read through this work at large. But I mean, it has a point to it. He's saying there's a reason that these are used as such in the story, and
right.
Here it is.
In Saracen, the standard masculine, I think perhaps at some other point he says the standard masculine spelling of it is with a Z, Sarrazin, right? And it's this idea that when you first encounter it, if you're a French speaker or Italian,
or if you're familiar,
or whatever,
with it, yeah.
I guess it's French, or no, Italian, right? If you're an Italian speaker, you know that Saracen is a feminine version of the masculine Sarrazin. So you see this name and you consider it a feminine name, but he is actually a man. But
again, I don't want to dwell too much on this, and I'm going to kind of breeze over a few other sections after this because they're focusing more on how, on elements of the story versus the grander, ideas that are in some of the other sections. So the next one in 48 is the unformulated enigma, which is dealing with basically where SZ was musing on Saracen. The unformed enigma is musing on Zambinella,
right.
and how like there's parallels in French language. But regardless, again, I don't want to focus on these sections. We interrupt this regularly scheduled close reading of Barthes to inject our own musings into the text. I have long felt after reading Barthes that it was closely tied to Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations of language. So, specifically, the idea of the family of resemblances, to which I will read some quotes for. Instead of producing something common to all that we call language, I'm saying that these phenomena have no one thing in common which makes us use the same word for all, but that they are related to one another in many different ways. It is because of this relationship, or these relationships, that we call them all language. So he goes through the idea that language itself cannot be unified in an easy, like, set theory.
It's hard to
style
pin down.
A style of a description. He uses games as his way of describing his theory of the family of resemblances, which are, in a sense, threads being woven into a larger braid that can be defined as what language is or what games are. And he also wants to highlight, though, that the idea that these are not Venn diagrams linked together. These are that, like, for instance,
it's hard to reduce it to something like that.
Right.
What is involved with games? Is it competition? Well, not everything that is a competition is a game, and not all games have necessarily a competitive element, although that's probably the one that can be argued the most. Often games have team dynamic to it, but not all games have a team dynamic, and not everything that has a team dynamic is a game. So I feel that a lot of his, like the Wittgensteinian concept of family resemblances, apply to what Barthes is trying to describe through narrative. And art is actually one of the famous examples of the family resemblances. So I would like to give a parallel here with Scott and Steve-O reading off quotes as they will.
Sure. So early on in SC, it's very actually similar. There's a lot of resemblance to what you to Wittgenstein's quote there.
Actually, Scott, if I may interject for 1 second, what work of Wittgenstein is this from?
The Philosophical Investigations.
Okay.
In an early section, titled, in fact, The Weaving of Voices, sort of like the braid-like thing you were saying, Barthes says, "Here I'll use code not in the sense of a list, a paradigm that must be reconstituted. The code is a perspective of quotations, a mirage of structures. We know only its departure and returns, the units which have resulted from it." So sort of what you're saying, like, it's hard to pin down. It's sort of like an amorphous, like, collective, if you will. But basically, if I had to parse it down to a saying, is like, I know it when I see it.
Right. And in the same way that Wittgenstein is trying to figure out what constitutes a game, or trying to find out if there is actually a set that constitutes what a game is.
Well, he rejects the set downright because the set says that there's one overriding element that defines
it's like almost too
the members of
simplified,
the set.
kind of.
Where here he goes in describing, again, oddly enough, Wittgenstein and Barthes write very similarly.
Right.
So he's giving, and we extend our concept of number, as in spinning a thread, we twist fiber on fiber, and the strength of the thread does not reside in the fact that some one fiber runs through its whole length, but in the overlapping of many fibers.
Yes.
And I feel that's very much what he's saying about codes in narrative, that each code demonstrates a possible thread within the fiber of narrative.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It doesn't and he specifically states that none of the codes there's no hierarchy.
You can't like boil it down to one over the other.
Right. I guess that's the point. It's not that he's trying to find the common threads throughout all games. In this work, Wittgenstein is, and Barthes is trying to find the common threads throughout narrative. And it's not that it needs these threads to exist as that thing
necessarily,
but it's that these are found most commonly in these things, and that's kind of where people get their definition of a game or a narrative from.
And in the sense that you can take one of the codes or one of the elements, one of the threads from the game or one of the codes from narrative, and those don't necessarily apply. You can apply that to things that aren't narrative and narrative at the same time. You can reference...
They'll be valid in both senses.
Like the code of reference, for instance. Yeah. You can reference something without having it at all have a narrative meaning to it, but reference tends to be a common thread amongst this resemblance.
It also is used in narrative.
Exactly.
Sure.
He says in that same section, the weaving of voices, where he's trying to figure out. I guess in the previous section, the 5 codes, he's trying to figure out what codes go into creating a narrative, and then he's talking about weaving these all together in the next section, and he says the 5 codes create a kind of network through which the entire text passes.
Or rather,
in passing becomes text.
I think that's an important little sentence.
And that's kind of what Wittgenstein is, I think,
getting
saying,
at,
where like in having these parts within it, this is what constitutes a game. It's not necessarily that it has all of these parts at all times, or even ever.
Or every game has the same parts.
Right.
That is to say,
it's just that these are parts that are known to be a part of games.
So, just like Bart, we are more musing here than trying to give definite answers. It's just something that I noticed while I was reading Bart that happened to have coincided with something that Wittgenstein wrote.
Yeah, we noticed a connection.
I could definitely see there having, at least at some point, Bart having read Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
So I just thought it was interesting. Now back to our regularly scheduled close reading of Bart.
And we have just one up Bart himself.
So we're on to the next section, The Voice, which begins, really begins the heavy sexual undertones that are involved in Saracen. So, opera is erotic. That is my full notes on The Voice.
That's a really funny little summary of what he's saying. Sure, that's true. I guess beyond that, he's basically pointing out that as a device used in the story, you sort of need to have that as a mindset, I guess.
And also how, again, I don't want to go into the story. This is more of dealing with sexualization. So we're on to 50, which is the reassembled body. And this is actually a kind of, again, dealing with sexuality and fetishism.
Sort of.
And how...
Well, yes. Not sort of. It is dealing with that, but...
Yeah.
And how describing beauty and sexuality, you tend to focus on parts of a person. Their hair, their face, whatever. Basically, as parts of whatever floats your boat.
I actually found this part really interesting.
Yeah. You, as a person who's describing, have your, in a sense, fetish. Mm-hmm. And a sculptor's job is to combine all the fetishes into one product.
Single whole
work. Yeah, exactly.
And that the text, actually, I think this is the next part.
The idea
is the Liaison, which deals with writers kind of are the antithesis to the sculptor, where the writer has to focus on and text fetishizes.
Mm.
So
I think that was interesting. The idea
I like that one as
the
well.
whole every person is viewed as a. He took the parts of the body for instance in this, but every person is viewed as a sum of their parts. Which is kind of interesting, especially in a story like this.
Now I'll give actually a quote from that. This is from the Liaison, which is, "She was beautiful for her arms, necks, eyebrows, nose, eyelashes, etc." Again, you're dealing with these broken down elements,
right?
Yep.
But
which is, as he also writes thereafter, which is doomed through by its very structure. So right, you're forced to break it down to a description of X, Y, Z, A, B, C, etc. But that's not necessarily the total whole. Nevertheless, that's how you have to describe it.
And also, it's dealing with the idea is that with fetishism, you can't see a whole. It makes the whole oblique.
Yes.
And that you can only view the part that you're attached to.
Yeah.
But the next part is actually kind of deviating from that a little bit, is 52, the masterpiece, which is going back to the writerly versus readerly text. And the masterpiece is the readerly text that approaches the as much as it can
as it
converges,
kind of,
right?
And how this is going back to the sculptor, that the sculptor attempts to unify beauty and all concepts of beauty into a masterpiece.
That's pretty much it.
Okay, and now we're going to go right back into that damn dirty sex with 53, euphemism.
Ooh.
Which is this. I want to read Freud on Barthes.
That would be a good read. Yes.
Can we? I think somebody should write that. Freud on Barthes.
He is writing about how, in a sense, how sexuality needs to be euphemized in a lot of texts, and how oftentimes you can draw things that aren't explicitly sexual out of a story and find the sexuality that was there.
Yes.
I hope you have a section that you're going to read on this one.
Well, I was going to say, sometimes, though, a Saracen is just a Saracen, as we know, but...
Sometimes an S is just an S, and a Z is just a Z.
Yes.
Now, all right, well, the example he gives is that I'm going to be... I apologize in advance for saying
No, let's get vulgar on this one.
Yeah. I suppose implied, I didn't get out of this out of my reading of Saracen, that while Saracen was in the theater listening to the opera and seeing Liaison, his one true love, he had an orgasm in the theater.
He jizzed in his pants, if you will, like, the parlance of our times.
And this is Bart arguing that was the intent all along.
Right, he just couldn't say it in those terms.
This seems like an overreach on Bart's part, I think. Like, I'm not sure. I know there are theaters that you go to for this type of thing. I don't know if the opera is one of those places.
Yeah, but he's saying to Saracen, to the character, it was like upon seeing Zambonella. Like, I get that point.
Yeah, that seems like he takes Balzac as just this writer that's like, yeah, I'm gonna have my character come in his pants in the middle of a theater, but I'm gonna do it all through euphemism.
A romantic story about castration. To read into this scene at the theater a solitary orgasm. To substitute an erotic story for the euphematic version. This operation of reading is based not on the lexicon of symbols, but on the systematic cohesion, a congruence of relationships. It follows that the meanings of a text lies not in this or that interpretation, but in the diagrammatic totality of its readings in their plural system. So actually, I was a big fan of his chapter on the sitar, and I believe we're coming up to the tree soon, which deals graphically how this works. But the idea that, not the orgasm, Steven.
Oh man,
scrap it out.
But the idea that themes aren't necessarily have to be spelled out, and that you can draw them from, in a sense, the use of symbolism that has been over the course of an entire story, and like what the subtext of other scenes might actually draw a branch that has to deal with this one.
That connects
very
back.
Interesting to me. Although I don't necessarily think that it's the theme he thought it was.
Yeah,
sure.
But everybody's allowed to their own.
I get
themes,
how you could
guess.
get it out of the text, if you will.
Okay, so we're on to now 54. Behind Beyond. Scott, can you do a reading?
Sure. All right. So he's talking about how actually this one is not bad. So the nature of Saracen as a sculptor, he says, continue undressing his model, which is Zambonella. The sculptor Saracen anticipates Freud, who, apropos of Leonardo, of course, identifies sculpture with analysis. Each is a vide la varve, or I believe that's a French term, or clearing away. Returning to a gesture of his childhood, Saracen, he whittled the pews to carve clumsy figures. The sculptor now tears off Labenzella's veils to get at what he believes to be the truth about her body. For his part, the subject Saracen, through repeated snares, proceeds ineluctably towards the real condition of the castrato, the void which is his center, etc. So, I mean, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I kind of liked it because it speaks to his character. Like, that's what he would do as a sculptor, artist, if you will.
I thought this was one of the more interesting little asides in the book, actually. The idea that he is carving this La Zambonella over and over and over again, like all these different, sculptures that he does of her.
Yeah.
And he never knows what's beneath the clothing that she's wearing every time he's seen her, and even though he tries to fill it in his mind, he never can actually get it because he doesn't know what's actually going on.
Yeah, he attempts to go titularly behind and beyond, but there's a point in which you cannot.
So, yeah, I think that there's an interesting musing, as we have often said about Bart, on the idea of realism versus a heavy analysis. And he kind of goes into the flaws of realistic viewpoints because, Saracen is sculpting the perfect woman, except it's a man who's been castrated.
In his own mind, of course.
Because he can't get into
he doesn't know the true nature. Yeah. Sure.
So again, I don't think there's much else to say about
that. That's what's happening. Yeah. That's what's up, man. That's
what's behind and beyond.
Well, we're just doing a surface reading
Okay, so now we're on to language as nature, 55. It's actually a return, in a way, to the concept of delay that he brought up earlier, and kind of going further into it with... it's basically using his linguistical codes and rules to help an author create ambiguity in his story. I like a lot of these middle chapters because he's writing about how the author has to lie to his audience kind of constantly.
Yeah, you're right. I think that's the most interesting part about that's a good analysis or a good point about literary analysis.
There's a force in the sentence, linguistic entity, that domesticates the artifice of the narrative, a meaning that denies the meaning. But that's kind of what he's going into, the idea of that language can be used
sort of like
to
your
lie.
irony kind of thing as well, like sort of like it encompasses all of that.
Right.
But the idea is that I believe I'm going to paraphrase a quote from him earlier, which is, good narrative is extending a story as long as possible without, because ultimately it's that kind of, or the narrative closure.
It's the sleight of hand kind of trick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's, if you wrote a more pragmatic story with only the information that an audience needed to know for a story, it would be boring. So the idea is that to build tension, you need to play tricks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You need to
have traps.
You have to offer language that can be taken multiple ways. And I think he's actually going to go into this a little bit later with the idea of ambiguity.
Yeah, real quickly, it's almost like, I know this has a bad connotation, but the first thing I thought of is it's like it's padding, but not padding per se, like for no reason. It's because the structure of narrative demands something like that.
It's to get you in a different mindset so that when something is revealed, it is more impactful.
Yes, exactly.
And then fine, I'll do one last quote then. Whereby we see that denotation is not the truth of discourse. Denotation is not outside the structures. It has a structural function on par with the others, not a justifying structure. It furnishes the codes with a kind of precious excipient, but in a circular fashion. It is also a particular specialized substance used by other codes to smooth the articulation.
Yeah. And that's actually pretty good. Like, Barthes was spot on that one, I think.
So on to the next section. We're on 56 now, the tree, which gives his kind of a visual representation of how language, in a sense, is almost
it's like a sentence diagram, but way more than beyond that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going for. But it's mostly, I think, a rejection of the sentence diagram. It's the idea that, I study linguistics, and it heavily focuses on a single structure for a sentence.
Right.
Here, he's giving a kind of a narrative structure,
like permutations of it, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea, instead of a tree, I'll be using an octopus with its tendrils.
Yes.
And how...
It's a Hydra sentence.
Yeah. And how these kind of tentacles can wrap from sentence to sentence, all with, going back to the sitar, with attempting to define this concept that the author wants to, whether the part, again, going back to Barthes, the party is wealthy. The party is glamorous.
Right.
How do you... here's how all the tendrils in the story, in those paragraphs, attach themselves to that initial idea.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's very visually well displayed.
And basically, to sum it up, it's a diagram showing the implications of actions in narrative and descriptors. So any other thoughts?
Nope. I mean, it's well done. It's, again, a good analysis. At least it was one of the ones I like more broadly than the others.
Yeah, it's an interesting example of how everything ties together and kind of makes all these disparate parts into a whole.
Sure.
And so the next one is called The Lines of Destination, which actually ties in with a podcast we haven't released yet, which will be Kevin Levine's speech on...
Ken Levine.
Ken Levine?
Yep.
On narrative Legos, yes. The idea of that.
So this is the idea of each character should have their own kind of desires and passions, to use
levels of interest, I
Levine's,
guess we'll say,
terminology,
yeah.
And how there's, in a sense, a causal nexus by where character starts at point A, it wants to get to point B, how all these characters over the course of the story reach that.
Yeah, no, I like that. The causal nexus, I think, is well stated, and it's basically like what he lays out here.
Yeah.
And then we're on to 58, which is the story's interest. Now, I actually thought this was a really, really good discussion over the idea that the author, in a sense, being the god of a world, though he doesn't use any of that terminology. I knew you would say something
like that about this section.
But it's the idea that that because of the nature of a story, all the characters are fated to have an ending. They start. There's you can read a story and say, why didn't a character do this, or why didn't a character do that?
Right, exactly. So in this section, Barthes says, Saracen is not free to reject the Italian's warning in the story itself. If he were to heed it and refrain from pursuing his venture, there would be no story.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Narrative fates its characters.
Yes.
And I think that it's not only... It's a necessary evil in a way.
Kind of.
Because there wouldn't be a story otherwise.
That's a funny way of phrasing it. I don't know if it's necessary. It's just like inherently, again, in the structure of story.
But here's the thing: is characters who fall in love will always fall in love. Characters who are going to die will always die. There's no way you can read a story.
There's no other option.
Really.
And,
you cannot scream at a TV screen, "Don't go in that door." And,
they're gonna fucking do it. I don't know what to say.
Well, I think that's absolutely correct, but I like that people look at stuff like this and now try to play off of it and have little meta commentaries on it. Like there's a commercial when you go to see a movie nowadays where I think it's a woman going up to a door and she just hears people from the audience screaming, "Don't go in that door," and she's like, okay, fine, I won't.
She's like, "Oh, thanks."
It's kind of everybody kind of plays off of that type of stuff now because it's known. It's a known way.
So,
of
are you
telling a story.
suggesting that it's using reference through irony to make a point?
Yes, I think that's exactly what it's doing.
Yeah,
that's all right all along. All right, so now we're on to the next segment: 3 codes together, and this is kind of actually going. It's so strange because he kind of sets up ideas, goes into them further, jumps to another idea. This is really tied into, again, just like I mentioned, that idea with the irony for referential. This thing that codes, in a sense, can become cliches over time.
Yeah.
And that you need to combine codes such as referential and irony, to go back to it, to keep things fresh. And he gives an example.
Or at least to have your story feel fresh.
Okay, I'm going to read a little bit of this. In saying that Saracen had expected a dim room, some jealous person, death and love, etc., the discourse mingles 3 disconnected codes, each absorbing the others, from 3 different sources. The code of passion establishes what Saracen is supposed to be feeling. The novelistic code transforms this feeling into literature. It is a code of an author in good faith, an author who has no doubt that the novelistic is a just, natural expression of passion. The ironic code absorbs the naivete of the first 2 codes as a novelist undertakes to speak of the character. The ironist... I didn't know ironist was such a thing.
It is now. It is for Barthes.
Undertakes to speak of the novelist. Saracen's natural language is spoken twice. It would suffice to produce, on the model of the sentence, a pastiche of Balzac to back up still further the terrancing of the codes. But that goes back to that idea that you can not only it's a cliche, but it's the author can use cliches to have an impact in storytelling.
Exactly.
So it's providing an expectation from the audience and then denying them that expectation by subverting the code.
Which is such a huge part of storytelling. Mm-hmm. It's just a part that's embedded in the way that you tell a story, is that you need to lead people down false paths in order to make a interesting story.
Yeah.
Yes, which actually kind of ties into the next section.
Yeah. Casuistry of discourse. All right, which is 60. Scott, would you like to speak a little bit about that?
I like this one because I'm a big fan, as a want-to-be writer, an interest in writing, that there are very, very subtle and various meanings you can get out of an explicit phrase or a word itself. So this one starts off with, in the story, Saracen is greeted warmly enough. Now enough is emphasized. It's a curious qualifier, reducing a possible extremely or very. It reduces the positive itself. These warm enough greetings are actually something less than warm, or at least on the surface, warm with embarrassment and reticence, etc. So it's basically like he's pointing out a point in the story in which, as he writes a little bit later on in this section, the author is trying to lie as little as possible, going back to what we were saying, but he still has to give you some information.
Right.
But the way it's phrased, like, balances that sort of, not closing it off, but giving you just enough to keep you going along.
In fact, a number of these next sections really delve into those idea of manipulating codes to serve the author's intent. So the next one is narcissistic proof, which is the idea of love and beauty are heavily attached together in the novelistic code.
Right.
It's in a sense like a Chekhov's gun type thing, or Chekhov's beauty. If a character describes another character as beautiful, there's probably at least some semblance of love there.
And there's a reason for it. Like in that, very well said as far as Chekhov's beauty. Like there's a reason that's said, and that will come into play in some future part of the story.
And here he gives an example of Saracen describing Zambonilla as beautiful, and he's blinded because of like the nature of love and beauty as we come to expect. He's blinded, and the audience is blinded to the fact that it's not a woman.
Right.
Because he's, in a sense, it's almost the unreliable narrator.
Yes.
Which is dealing with the idea that he's so smitten that he fools everyone involved.
Yep, exactly. And again, like, it's also a pretty good segue to the next section, which is equivocation, the double understanding, which is sort of like, as I was just saying about the previous one, where in the story, one of the members of La Zambonilla's entourage says to Saracen, quote, "You have no rival." Now, taken two ways, because either you are loved, that's Saracen's, of course, character understanding, or you are wearing a castrato. So, it's a double entendre. Not a double entendre, but you can get various meanings out of it, depending on how the story demands.
Mm-hmm. And again, it's going back to those use of codes in order to purposely build ambiguity.
Yeah, smoke and mirrors, if you will, in narrative.
And then there is the next section, which is the psychological proof, which is, again, going to the use of cliches to mislead the audience.
Right. To throw you off the trail, if you will.
Yes, for narrative. And I think these are all just kind of examples or slight differences between the same concept of using codes in order to manipulate.
Just expounding on that idea a little bit.
Actually, this one, our final one, which will be 64, is the voice of the reader, which is dealing with the author using a certain language in order that none of the characters are speaking this, but is using language in order to evoke a certain mindset or emotion within the reader themselves.
Yeah. Right. Again, it's not a sort of grammatical trick, but in order to achieve that goal.
This is a really interesting thing that you're describing this whole situation. The characters in your story are completely unaware of the language that you're using as an author, but the readers are getting a feel for this.
Of course, yeah, there's that layer, obviously.
Perhaps, obviously the characters aren't real people, but perhaps different than what the characters are feeling. Like, you as a reader have a completely different understanding of the situation than the characters in the book or short story or whatever that you're reading
sort of the nesting
actually have.
Thing.
Yeah, which I thought was pretty interesting.
No, it's definitely a good point, and yeah, it's of course relevant to narrative.
All right, to give an example on that, he actually quotes Saracen, which is, "La Zambonilla remained thoughtful as though terror-struck." Then Barthes asks, "Who is speaking here? It cannot be Saracen." And he goes through every single character on who could have been
There's no possible
terror-struck.
interpretation of characters in which you can get that sentence out of.
Yeah, the only one it was meant for is the audience. Mm-hmm. And it was to, in a sense, manipulate. Although manipulation has kind of negative connotation, but that's not necessarily what I think Bart or I mean.
Again, it's to keep the trick the trick of narrative itself going along.
Yeah. So that's it for now. I'm Jonathan Manser, here with Scott Dilla.
See you next time in the next section.
And Stephen Ramosi.
Have a good one.
This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course. Music by Christopher Morgan. Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manser.